Okay, so we're going to talk about taboos. We're going to stay away, hopefully, from the most awful taboo topics, because we don't really need them in the room, but some of the conversations might make you a little bit uncomfortable. I did actually write a line in here that said, especially if James is talking, but Aaron sent me a message saying, you're worried about James? Thanks, Aaron. Didn't feel threatened at all. We are here to talk about taboos, how they've functioned in the past. Taboos evolve in society much in the same way as language evolves. There's an ebb and a flow. Societies can remove a taboo based on practical necessity, and religious taboos are often worked around. So we're going to peek through the lens of taboos, former taboos, current taboos in flux, and also some which seem as though they may persist forever. Now, when I first started looking into the topic, I did expect things to be a little bit more clear than they turned out to be. So I just want to check something with the audience. By a show of hands, I want you to vote on whether the following illegal activities are taboo or not. So, driving in the UK, driving 74 miles per hour on the motorway where the speed limit is 70. Is that taboo? Not much support for that. Driving too fast and causing a minor accident. A little bit, yeah. Causing an accident resulting in injury while driving intoxicated. Okay. I noticed there was still some without their hands up. So, okay, I think we're judging the audience perfectly here. So these are all illegal, but not all of them are taboo. It's interesting, isn't it? So my first question is to James. James, what is a taboo, please?
It's a bad thing. Sort of solved. I have a dictionary definition here if you'd like to hear it. It's a social or religious custom prohibiting or restricting a particular practice or forbidding association with a particular person, place, or thing. More simply, a taboo is something that's a strong prohibition on something. Typically, these revolve around things that are forbidden to eat or drink, things that you're forbidden to do, or people that you're forbidden to have sex with, or things you're forbidden to have sex with. We have, like, some examples might be murder is a taboo, incest, but also, like you mentioned, there's other things you may not think of as taboos. For example, pregnant women drinking alcohol, I think, could be considered a taboo. So yeah, that's my quick definition.
Okay, anybody want to expand on that definition? All right, well, the word... Did somebody go to talk then?
Nailed
You're going to have to get in faster.
Oh, look, I think there's probably a couple implicit things that go into it as well, that taboos are generally... I mean, I'm curious to get a show of hands on this as well. How many of you would agree that taboo carries the implication of this is not something we're going to talk about or argue about whether this is ethical or not, which means it's somewhat inherently irrational or unreasonable, which means it's often regressive or conservative in harmful ways. Does that seem generally the case? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, cool. Anything about that, Kirsty? No?
Did you say unreasonable? I got the book for you.
Yeah, for sure.
Advertising your book on the stage here.
Unreasonable, breaking the rules and making things better. So.
It's a little bit tough.
Yeah,
Let's see.
and I mean, I think this is really important because I think modern liberal society, one way to understand it is trying to separate taboos from actual moral beliefs. I think it's worth noting this use of the word taboo is probably racist because this comes from Tonga, it comes from...
Polynesia,
right. And it's probably a colonialist going and seeing some other cultures doing their version of ethics and calling it inferior to our Western, rational, argue these things out version of ethics. Yeah.
Okay, so Aaron, sticking with you for a moment. A moment ago, the audience basically gave me permission to speed on the motorway. Thank you. But not everybody not everybody agreed with each other. What's the difference between a taboo and something that's just like frowned on?
I mean, I think the major part is the willingness to openly debate the taboo. And it's why in liberalism, I think we see a lot of pushback against it. I think there's an interesting split So nowadays we have like our classical liberals or Jonathan Haidt's and whatnot, and then you have like your, woke progressive liberals. And I think the big difference between them is that both groups are okay with taboos around behaviors, but there's a lot of argument around taboos around language and what we're allowed to talk about. And I think the reason is, there's some reason to think that we want to just be able to debate everything, and then there's some reason to think that's not a great idea, and maybe we shouldn't debate everything publicly, and that sort of divides the world. But yeah, I think the big difference would be whether or not we can have an argument about this openly.
So if somebody's doing something that's taboo, what's the peril for them, Kirsty? How does the brain work when it's processing a taboo?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'll give it a go. Donald McKay, who's a cognitive psychologist at UCLA, says that when a taboo is broken, it triggers a reaction in the amygdala, which is that bit just above the brainstem that manages strong emotions like fear and threat, but also pleasure. So there are those two things going hand in hand. But as I said, I'm a cultural sociologist, so really I'm much more interested in how we practically, in everyday life, navigate those rules and norms that are designed to encourage pro-social behaviour and to discourage deviance. And what really interests me about taboos is that original usage was about respect for the norms of nature in Polynesian and other indigenous cultures. It was about keeping humanity in balance, like, for example, eating particular foods were taboo, tapu, prohibited, because they were sacred and needed protecting. And that usage is still in parlance today. There's a lot of research in taboos in conservation, like in Madagascar, there are systems of prohibitions known as FADI, which are strict taboos in which species are allowed or not allowed to be hunted or harvested. But then you're absolutely right in saying that it was a neocolonialist adoption, because really, taboo in the UK came into common parlance thanks to the Victorians, who twisted it. And of course, that was a time of strict social hierarchies breaking down, intense class anxieties, the rise of rationalism and psychoanalysis warring with spiritualism and superstition. And taboo became adopted as a way to try to reconcile those things, to give superstitions the gloss of rational truth. And really, I mean, I write a lot more about this On Being Unreasonable. I don't have time to go into.
Do you have a book out,
today.
Kirsty?
I do.
That's good.
But they were designed to fight this perception that society was falling into anarchy by instilling control, strict emotional, sexual, and physical repression. And that's how we got things like table legs being unmentionables. That was a very strange taboo.
Very odd.
And I remember we're adding a little bit of extra history here. I think, broadly speaking, a lot of the colonial project is distinguishing between the rational, Western, central, and explaining why they have progressed so much compared to these other cultures who are irrational in their backwards ways and need to be civilized. You see violent civilizing of communities across every place that colonialism spreads. And it is, like a couple of the ideas involved in it are like the pushback on social ethics by individualist ethics, I think is really important. Our good friend John Stuart Mill comes along and says, the best way to do ethics is every individual rationally thinks for themselves and figures out what's exactly right and screw society, they don't know anything, right? And sort of, we've moved past that a little bit in social psychology. You see more return to actually, social learning is pretty important, and having our ethics be based around social learning might not necessarily be a rational or a bad thing, but it is this kind of, during that period, there was a lot of anthropology being done by basically looking at indigenous people and saying, well, they're backwards and terrible, and then colonialists are amazing and great in these ways. What are they doing that's bad? Let's get away from that. And a lot of things got lumped into that category, it seems like.
They did, around the world, but also back home with people who were considered to be inferior here. There's a really interesting argument in Nina Auerbach's Woman and the Demon, who studied Victorian female stereotypes like the victim, the angel, the fallen outcast, the old maid. She said that stereotypical Victorian woman was considered to be always containing the possibility of fear, because she might be silent, she might be fragile, but she was capable of terrible transformation. And there's a beautiful line, the taboos that encased the Victorian woman contained buried tributes to her disruptive power. So when we say that taboo is a Victorian invention, what we mean is that that was a way to contain things that scared them, to contain people that posed a threat to the social order. And ironically, rather than helping us to keep in touch with nature, the result has been the near complete disconnection of our bodies, our emotions, and our lives from the more than human world.
Okay, thank you. James, I want to talk about a specific taboo now, possibly an extreme one. You've researched anybody who's been a regular at the Skeptic Camp over the years has been damaged by James's talks. You've researched bestiality, cannibalism, inbreeding, many more. I can't remember the consanguinity or something. Oh, that's
consanguinity is
isn't
a measure of how blood-related people are, but incest, basically.
Right, so I want to consider the whole body of the research that you've done, but in particular the focus on cannibalism, because I think cannibalism is one of those which automatically feels wrong, doesn't it? No? Nobody? Just me?
I'll fight you on that one for sure.
I'll assume I'm wrong about that then. So about the topic itself, but about taboos in general, please.
Sure.
Just dive in, guys, anytime you want to.
So I have researched all the cardinal taboos. That's been my focus of research.
The cardinal.
That's what I like to think of them as, the big headliners. And the first thing I discovered when I started looking into things like cannibalism, necrophilia, bestiality, is that taboos happen. Which kind of surprised me. They almost feel so monstrous and bad that they're almost fantastical. But when you actually look into them, they do happen. We don't have taboos against things that are impossible or things that don't happen. We have prohibitions against things that do. So that's the first thing that I discovered. That all the taboos I've mentioned, there are examples of them happening in the human sphere. But secondly, what was most fascinating is that they also happen in the animal sphere, in non-human animals in the animal kingdom. And that sounds like that shouldn't be right. Almost animals should be more wise or should be better than us and not engage in these weird things, but of course they do. And a great example of that is cannibalism. Something that certainly when I first started researching it felt entirely wrong, entirely unnatural, but when you look into it, actually is an incredibly common feature of the animal world, incredibly common feature of ecological systems. Cannibalism as a matter of course, as a matter of just animals' existence, apart from starvation, has now been observed in over 1,500 species in the wild. It happens in carnivores, it happens in herbivores, it happens in marine animals, in terrestrial animals. In fact, it happens almost more often sometimes in herbivores, which is weird. Gerbils eat baby gerbils as a matter of course as they go. Sand tiger sharks eat each other in utero. There's sexual cannibalism, all sorts of things happening all over the place, and it happens for a whole host of reasons. It can be density, it can be population control, it can just be entirely casual because you're a bit hungry, and that particular individual looks a bit weak and easy to kill, and so that kind of thing. And then in the human sphere, cannibalism is a feature of many cultures throughout history, and in fact is most likely still practiced in some cultures to this day. It can happen for, there's a thing called exo-cannibalism, where you might eat an enemy or someone from the out-group as a form of domination or power transfer, or you might eat someone, a loved one who died as a form of restitution or a type of mourning, that kind of thing. So I could talk forever about this, but I guess what I've learned mostly is that, pardon the pun, you can't trust your gut. Even if a taboo that you have grown up with and feels wrong and feels unnatural is not necessarily the case. And in fact, it can be a perfectly normal part of the world.
Right.
I should add that your feelings about it are probably also colonialist in nature.
I mean, yeah,
I'm not kidding. The number one way that they dehumanized indigenous peoples when they justified the things they did to them was accuse them of cannibalism.
yeah.
Which was,
I mean, the word cannibal is a racist term. It comes from a mispronunciation of the Carib people when the colonialists arrived in the Americas, discovered these people called the Caribs, who they then heard rumors of people eating, but then they used that accusation as a way of justifying the enslavement and brutalization of the communities.
in fact, if you look at the first European map ever made of America, it has a cannibal on it. In its, there be dragons kind of way. This is very, very common.
Kirsty, just looking at things from a different direction, I read an article you wrote back in 2018, not expecting you to remember it word for word. The headline was Why It's Okay to Have Bad Manners. And I was particularly interested in it because at a certain point in the article, you actually flipped the perspective and you talked about the manner in which the taboo enforcers were shaming the taboo breakers. So I just wanted to spend a few moments. What does the taboo enforcer get out of this deal?
I have since expanded on that thinking because that was just a small clickbait headline-y BBC article.
Go deep, Andy. Go deep, they said.
In work that I shall not mention, but
Is it in the book?
It's I mean,
Is that why?
I didn't mean
Pass me
to
that book,
write
please,
a
Andy.
whole book.
I want that book. I want the
Being
book.
unreasonable.
Stop talking about the sodden book.
I
Got a book there.
just realised that we have a really big problem in the way that we use that word.
Okay.
And I'm desperately trying to get us to think really carefully and critically about some of our more complex issues of human relations. So in that article you read, I said that we tend to think that rules and norms are simple, just common sense, obvious. But the research that I've done, for example, looking at theatre audiences and how they police the behaviour of each other, shows that actually these things aren't simple at all. So, for example, there's something we called access friction, which is where one person's legitimate disability needs conflict with somebody else. Like, for example, relaxed performances, they're designed for particularly people with Tourette's and neurodivergences that mean they can't force their bodies into the norm of silent reverence.
Right.
But they can conflict with, say, deaf people's need to use audio hearing loops. So even when it comes to these really key questions about how we are including different people, different bodies and different subjectivities in social space, there are massive conflicting needs, but also conflicting pleasures. Like, for example, a lot of people are now coming to the theatre saying, I don't want to sit in silent reverence. That too was a colonial construction, coming from about the same time and place, the desire to force out anarchy by forcing everybody into strict, silent, repressive control. And the problem that I'm seeing now is that obviously as a society we need a mechanism for drawing lines between appropriate and inappropriate, acceptable and unacceptable. Shame and judgment and censure are not in and of themselves bad things. Because if you see somebody, say, being sexually abusive on public transport, then the moral thing to do is to step in and not to be tolerant of that great injustice. However, we've also seen moments where that sense of self-righteousness, what I call unreasonably reasonableness, is being used to stymie social change, to keep existing power structures in order, to keep the different social classes in their place. And we've seen this really recently in the rise of Karen videos, they're often called, where predominantly white incoming people in a neighbourhood start deciding that they are the managers of everybody else in that space and decide who does and doesn't belong. And predominantly it's people of colour who then are being harmed by these things. So our seemingly reasonable judgments about bad behaviour can sometimes be deeply unreasonable in ways that we don't necessarily always see. And I don't need to buy the book because I've just told you what it's about.
I recommend the book. It seems very good to me. I wish I'd read it.
Thanks.
I'm still interested in, James, I'm still interested in this idea of what the taboo enforcer get. Because I can see like power going to the head in certain situations. Is there like a reward mechanism, in your view, for the taboo enforcer? Or is it always a practical matter?
I mean, when I was listening to what you were saying, it made me think that taboos can be tools. Taboos can be tools of oppression, can be tools of suppression and prohibition. I think what the taboo enforcer would get is the sense of that they're doing the right thing, that they are enforcing something that is self-evidently right. So I'm going to enforce this thing. As in what's going on, like brain-wise, I don't understand. But I think they get a sense of enforcing a self-evident truth, in their opinion.
Okay.
I mean, there's good psych evidence that some of the earlier parts of our brains, the hardwired parts, are things like fairness and pro-social learning. We very quickly learned to mimic responses to behavior. There's a controversial study involving a doll, and a person comes and abuses the doll and then gets positive feedback, and the young people learn from that. But there's also these studies where like very young individuals will punish people who they think are rule breakers or doing something unfair, even at a personal cost to themselves. And I think it's reasonable to think that like we have a pretty strong, whatever chemical it is, popping in our brains when we get to enforce those mechanisms.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to take a couple of questions in a minute, just in a minute. Just to expand on a topic we've already touched on, can taboos be a good thing, Aaron?
So I think, again, this depends on how we define it. If we mean this, thing that we can never talk about, some people are going to say that's always worse than in ethics where we can openly debate everything. That is the sort of classical liberal view. Everything is better if we just get it out in the open. I don't necessarily agree with that, partly because I don't think it's accurate to human psychology. It assumes that that kind of debate always solves disagreements, and I don't think that's true. But I just think there's a cost to openly debating every single subject every single time, even stuff like language. Even if we just restrict it to like what words you're allowed to use or not, right? There's a word that I don't have to say out loud that is now already in all of y'all's heads, and if I said it out loud, it would end this panel, right? Even saying the letter N is enough that like wherever our hosts are, they're now slightly more
shitting themselves.
Yeah. You might be slightly more anxious just hearing me broach the concept, right? I think it's totally fine that we not debate whether we can use this word openly in public or not. There's no benefit, okay? It's unfortunate that the history of colonialism has resulted in a word so terrible that we should just never, ever use it. But I think that's just where we are, and I don't think we need to argue about it, and I think that's not irrational at all.
But that agreement that we've come to through discussion, or we've come to, it's not as if we all spontaneously agreed that we're going to use that word. There has been a discussion. So I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing about it, but at some point we need to discuss it at some point in order to agree that not to use it.
Yeah, and like when I teach ethics, I talk to my students like it's a CDC situation, right? Like people say, get it out in the open, right? I think some concepts are weaponized. Anthrax, don't get them out in the open, right? Have that debate in a really controlled space where people understand what they're getting into.
Yeah.
Okay, don't just do it on the street corner. So yeah, like in that sense, there are no taboos in the modern world because we've debated all of these topics somewhere at some point. But they're taboo in the sense that we're not just going to pop open this conversation in the bar.
Okay.
You were absolutely right, I think, when you said that taboos are a tool. Rules and norms are a tool. Censure and shame and judgment are tools. Social media is a tool. Civic debate is a tool. All of these things are not inherently good or bad. They can be used for purposes of inculcating justice, or they can be used to stymie social change. It's not what these tools are in and of themselves, it's how we use them and the uses we put them to that we need to be examining.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kirsty. Ed, can you turn this thing up, please? Right, this is a throw box. We're going to ask some questions now. So some hands in the air already. When you receive it, speak directly into the cross on the top. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Or shout. The idea of the throw box is so we can get it around the room. So I'll take a question over here, it'll be you, and then we'll move it over here, and then we'll move it out, and you can just toss it along. It's an audience participation thing. I'm going to throw it there because I don't want to hit these antennae.
Yeah,
Closer.
Like this?
Yes.
All right. Okay.
Close, Clarice, close.
Make out with the microphone. So I am really interested in kind of the panel's discussion has been really interesting, but I think one thing I haven't heard a lot about is in the case of cannibalism, in the case of the theater rules, in the case of all of these, what does the evolution of these things look like? How does that work in a society? How does it become okay in this Caribbean culture to maybe not like cannibalism isn't as regular as like the colonizers thought it was, but maybe it's a little less taboo than it is for Europeans. But then how did it become that way? How does that mechanism work?
Do you want to take cannibalism? And I'll take the theatre.
Okay, fantastic. Great double act, this. I like it. I think the question you're asking is really complicated because you're, from what I understand your question, you're sort of asking how do thoughts and beliefs change in cultures? And I think I can talk about cannibalism. In terms of evolutionarily, cannibalism may well have played a huge part in our evolution. And we know that it happens in our closest relatives, and we know that it's happened in our early ancestry. There's evidence of cannibalism in several early hominids, including ourselves. In terms of why that isn't a thing in your culture or our culture, but has been elsewhere. Probably things like the advent of agriculture, probably the better availability of food, probably that having less offspring, and so the price of eating offspring or eating conspecifics is greater. And remember that cannibalism also, it may well be taboo and not non-existent in our culture, but it still is in existence in others. So why do like taboos and ideas shift? I think for a whole host of environmental and sociological reasons. I don't think there's a single answer I could give for it.
And sometimes, as in the case with theatre and the arts more broadly, it is a case of top-down cultural elites, and I use that in the traditional sense, not the drinks the occasional pumpkin latte sense and reads The Guardian. So the TLDR version of this is in the 19th century, sudden mass migration to urban centres caused those strict social hierarchies I was talking about to break down. Previously, theatre had been a place where everyone could get together from society because they were going to be kept in their neatly segregated boxes. But then people like Matthew Arnold decided that because of this migration and the fact that suddenly strangers were flooding into these places, society was collapsing into anarchy. Does that sound familiar at all today? And the masses needed to be controlled. But it's okay, he said, in his extraordinarily influential kind of cross-Atlantic tour of its day, because we have the answer to this. We have a civilizing tool, and that is theatre, live performance, and the arts. So that's when he and a bunch of his other cultural elite mates, like famous critics and polemicists, newspaper people, and also conductors and theatre magnates, they actually inculcated a series of measures to physically control audiences and exclude anyone they decided couldn't behave correctly. So this is, first of all, relatively recent, this norm of complete, total, silent reverence, as opposed to kind of a more sociable form of consumption. And also, it is absolutely bound up in white supremacist, anti-working class mechanisms to culture and civilise the uncontrollable, chaotic, anarchic world.
We could also, during that same period, I also come from a theater background and missed the days when all of the prostitution took place in the top of the theater and all that, which itself, I guess, was a progression from it just taking place throughout the entire theater. But during that same period, to sort of further complicate the picture, you have this top-down thing. You also have this bottom-up as industrialization is leading to a middle class. That middle class wants to ape the actual aristocracy and upper class, who already are using these taboos for the purposes of controlling land, right? Because who you sleep with determines who gets the lands and whatnot. These folks then want to kind of mimic that, and so they start developing what we think of now as the modern gendered, two-sphere sexual divisions, where like women are kept cloistered and are the sort of vessels of purity, and it was all this kind of mimicry of the aristocracy to make them feel selves feel better than, again, the lowest of the lower class, right? So like, for example, like for a long time, people just had sex in the room with the kids because there was the one room and that was it, and you were going to have sex. It wasn't until during that period that you start to like see these sort of separations and walls go up around kinds of breaches of what we might think of as incest taboos.
Okay. There's another question in the far end of the room. So can we get the throw box over to, I can't remember your name, buddy. Chris, it's coming to you first. Oh, okay. Just toss it further over. Go on. Come on, throw it, quick.
Skeptics in sports, folks, skeptics in sports. This is more of an indoor conference.
There you go. Ask your question, please, but keep hold of it over there for the moment, please, rather than try and get it back to the front.
This is one for James. You said that there can't be a taboo about something that doesn't exist. How come there is a taboo around talking about God and religion?
Because maybe the question's rhetorical. Because the belief exists, and the structures of believing in God and believing in unreal things exist, and so there's a taboo against that. But because the belief's real.
All right, keep hold of that, please. Just pop it on the table or something. I'll get back to you in a minute about it. Right, so we're just going to move on to our next question now. And I'm going to choose a taboo, which, at least here in the UK, I hope, is a taboo from the past. Though, even with this example, it's by no means clear. In the UK in 1967, the Sexual Offences Act decriminalised homosexuality between men, activity between men. Now, it had never been illegal between women anyway. But obviously, that change in the law didn't suddenly signal a complete change of attitude among the population, but what it did achieve was it enabled people to legitimately gather in groups, to assemble and protest in support of a growing movement. And over time, attitudes have changed. Not to suggest for a moment that everything's perfect now, but what can this example tell us about how a taboo evolves and becomes mainstream? Does it always require an uprising? Who'd like to answer first, please?
Yeah, I don't think taboos being broken always necessarily requires an uprising or any sort of monumental event. I think mores and ethics and taboos sort of shift slowly over time, and the law is often the last thing to change. I think the example of sort of homosexuality being criminalised and becoming a taboo topic is an example of a taboo being used as a weapon of oppression, as a way of criminalising and dehumanising a whole population. I think it is scary when sort of normal human behaviour, people just engaging in their sexuality, can become taboo, and as people come to be dehumanised, I think it's a way in which taboos can be very dangerous.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the manner in which a taboo stops being a taboo. Kirsty, what can you say about that?
You're killing me because this is chapter 5.
Just give me a second, I'll summarise it. I'm going to save you 15 quid here. It's fine. It's fine.
It's got a good title, Where We're Going We Don't Need Roads. I live in Bristol. I was there when the statue of Colston was pulled down and chucked in the harbour, and I was there at the subsequent Kill the Bill protest, watching that police car being set on fire. And part of what I track is why it took so long, and particularly because I love words. I love words and language and talking about stuff so much that I've made studying it my entire life's work. And I was fascinated and appalled by the fact that words in that Colston case didn't do anything. They've been debating it and talking about it and applying social pressure and doing petitions and nice chalking on the pavement, sedate, very reasonable campaigns for decades, and still nothing changed. It took that sudden eruption, which the Colston 4 actually were acquitted because part of their defence was that pulling it down had prevented unreasonable harm from taking place to the black citizens of the city, having to walk past that monument to enslavement their whole lives. So sometimes, yes, history does show us that while grassroots, demure, more reasonable campaigns can move the needle, more often than not, it's, as the suffragette said, deeds, not words.
I want to problematize it a little bit further, because I do think, so that the argument about this argument goes, right? John Stuart Mill says we got to argue about everything, and then nowadays people are like, maybe we don't need to argue about everything, and actually that isn't always the way that things work. If these are socially enforced rules, the change in social behavior and enforcement of them is going to be a large part of it. So, people could argue that, like, it wasn't debates about gay people, it was will and grace. That, it was the first time somebody knew someone who was openly gay and couldn't hate that person, that they finally let go of that taboo or something like that. I think that's true. I also just want to go a little step further and say, I want to be concerned that, especially in the progressive sphere, we don't continue to buy into the idea that humans are fundamentally deeply irrational. Because what I hear a lot of times is debate doesn't work because human beings are irrational. And I don't think that's actually deeply true. I think human beings can be very reasonable, and I think disagreement and argument often does move hearts and minds when it's done properly. And once again, believing that we are all deeply irrational is colonialism, right? It is the way that they tell us that we need a Hobbesian state in order to protect us from ourselves, all right? So I think the answer is, you can argue with people sometimes, and sometimes you can just be like, look, this person is totally fine. There's nothing bad about this person. Leave it alone, right?
That is chapter 6.
Haven't even read the book, folks. Just
Public reason, debate, civic debate, is not inherently good or bad. It can work. Of course it can. Words can move mountains. But very often the model of debate, what we call debate, is deeply flawed because it's deliberately designed to encourage dissensus. It's not that people are inherently irrational and therefore can't be reasoned with. It's that our mechanisms for reason in the public sphere, particularly today, are broken. And the ancient Greeks understood that. They separated isagoria from parrhesia and put mechanisms in place called dogmasia to ensure that any public debate had to be undertaken with the intention of reaching shared truth. The Nyaya system in Hinduism understood that too. There were good, there were bad, and there were ugly debates.
And ugly debates aren't bad debates necessarily. This is the problem in the modern world, is civility porn. The idea that all debates have to be civil for them to be good is false. Right. Yeah. It's okay to shout sometimes.
It is.
Am I the only one here thinking this sounds like a really good book?
I'm not here to sell the book. I wrote the book because these are
self-promotion
important
taboo in this
ideas.
country? What is going on here? Aren't y'all not allowed to praise yourselves?
Oh yeah, no, we really absolutely are not. I have broken the biggest taboo possible here. Self-promotion of the British.
As an American, I'm very proud.
I apologise to Kirsty. I'm just having some fun at Kirsty's expense, so I'm glad you're playing along. We're getting toward the end of the panel now. I just want to ask, maybe the audience have their own ideas. I'll go to James first, and then I'll come to the audience and see if you can shout out any answers to this question. But are there any taboos within the sceptical or science community that we should be maybe self-aware about? Has anything come to mind? I'm going to ask you guys in a minute.
Yeah, no, I was sort of thinking about this question, and I couldn't necessarily think about any I couldn't think of like discrete examples of taboos in the skeptical and science community. However, I have witnessed in the last couple of years some transphobia within the skeptical community, I think that transness and discussions of transness in general is becoming taboo in parts of the far right and parts of the political spectrum, and definitely felt like for some people it's not been something able to talk about even. I think that's the thing with taboos, something that you mentioned earlier, Aaron, is that taboos are almost taboo to talk about, which I think makes them especially worrying. So I think just in general, we need to be really wary in the skeptical community of evocative topics that are coming up in the culture wars, topics that you feel like you can't talk about, or those are times where we must use our sort of rigor and especially our compassion to think and talk about.
Thank you. Kirsty, are there any taboos or subjects around that in the skeptical or science community we should be self-aware about?
I'm not sure about the skeptics community because, to be perfectly honest, I had to Google what that was when they invited me to come here.
There are too many definitions to get it accurate.
Yeah, and now, big fan. But my first thought was skepticism is this do your own research, post-truth, terrifying evil.
Yes.
And I'm happy to report I'm not getting any of that at all, quite
Fair
the
enough.
opposite. But
Fair enough.
in everyday life, I think one taboo that I really want us to address is don't talk about money, particularly in the workplace, because we know that that's being used as a tool to keep us impoverished and
Unequal
to keep pay
Yeah,
inequities in place.
absolutely.
So talk about pay and organise and agitate.
All right, lovely. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Aaron. Yeah, round of applause. Organise and agitate. I'll come to Aaron. I asked you if you would like to shout out any taboos in the skeptical science community. I saw a couple of hands. Let's hear some shouts.
It's taboo to call a pseudoscientist what we actually are on the
It's taboo to call a pseudoscientist a con man. Thank you. Anybody else?
It's taboo to consider emotional or even violent reactions as valid.
Okay, it's taboo to consider violent reactions as valid. Okay, thank you. Any more? A couple more?
I designed clinical trials, and to say that the placebo effect isn't real, that just creates such
I don't know if you heard that, but to argue that the placebo effect is, this is from a real researcher, we'll take your name later, arguing the placebo effect is real should be or is taboo.
even mentioning that it might not be.
Mentioning that it might not be as taboo. Yeah, it's a big deal in scientific circles, the belief in placebo, isn't it? So, but I'd like to remind you that the excellent group of musicians who opened up QED, they were named last night the control group for that reason. Should have been the control arm, I realise that. Yes?
Just to build on that point, I think there's something about the fact that a lot of the early discussion around placebo effects came from Ben Goldacre's book.
Oh, I know, yeah.
It's absolutely superb, and a lot of excellent work, but there is constantly the risk of hero worship and elevating individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, for those who didn't hear that, he basically trashed Ben Goldacre's work. Well, that's... sorry, Marianne, no time, I apologise. So we're moving toward the end now. And I'd like Aaron to answer that question in a moment as well. But we're going to move forward to the future after that, and we're going to talk about artificial intelligence. So get your thinking caps on about that. So, Aaron, what are your views on taboos within the skeptical or science community?
Yeah, I mean, I think we got to be careful and not sort of only view other people as having taboos that they need to work on. I think some of our taboos are good. I think some of our taboos are sometimes problematic, and I think they connect to the ongoing struggle about how to discuss things like trans rights, trans individuals. So a big one, I think, would be a kind of taboo around discussing trans individuals in sports, which, again, is an understandable reaction given the way that discussion is so readily weaponized against those individuals, the way that it's clearly used as a wedge issue against the trans community. But that being said, I think, and again, not just on the street corner, but like when I'm debating people or going on podcasts or something, I think it is valuable to be willing to say, let's talk about the details of sex differences in sports. And I think it's probably a little taboo in our community right now to say, look, there are biological sex differences between men and women. I think we would all acknowledge it if we were asked to do so, but it is a somewhat nerve-wracking topic, let's say. And I think a lot of people would prefer to simply avoid it. And I understand, and I'm sympathetic, but I want us to be a community where we can have individuals who are open to pushing back on that and not get attacked by their own community for being willing to engage in those discussions. Because, you know, when I have debates about stuff, I do sometimes get people who are like, you shouldn't even be talking to these people or having this discussion. And I do think that leans too far into the humans are irrational and we can only engage in violent conflict view. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. Okay, this is going to be our final bit. No time for additional questions from the audience, unfortunately. I just want to get the thoughts of my panellists on moving toward the future. I'm thinking about artificial intelligence in particular, but you could be thinking about anything. What do we think will be any new taboos emerging in the future or from the widespread adoption of AI? We'll just take it in order. James, if you want to go first.
I mean, AI is a new and terrifying technology. And we have this sort of like incredible reckless power of AI to create sort of whatever we want. I think we're already seeing new norms and taboos around AI. For example, I've seen huge backlash online from people making pornography of real people. So people making pornography of celebrities or of internet personalities, etc. I've seen huge backlash to that. So I think that is already becoming sort of a taboo of AI. It also AI gives you the power to break taboos in all new ways. For example, pedophiles are using AI to create images of AI-generated images of minors, that kind of thing. So, scary future.
Thank you.
Hope for the future is that a taboo develops around AI programmers nicking creatives' work uncredited. Hope for the future more broadly. The thing that's really worrying me is that climate protest is becoming a big taboo. Somehow we've got the hero narrative of the person who often violently attacks climate protesters and the villain of the person who's fighting for a livable world. We have to address these mechanisms that are encouraging us to see protesters fighting injustice as unreasonable and needing to be stamped out.
Thank you, Kirsty. Quick as you can, please, Aaron. Quick as you can.
Yeah, I mean, that one goes back again to like liberalism tamping down violent protests. Maybe sometimes ecological violent protest might be a good thing. But also on the AI thing, I think it's going to be relationships with AIs that's going to be a real taboo. A lot of taboos form around things that we feel uncomfortable about but can't quite form an argument necessarily immediately for why it's unethical. Having sex with sex bots is one thing, but forming deep, meaningful relationships with artificial entities is going to weird people out in a big way.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I want to hold that thought. Thank you to James Williams, Aaron Rabinowitz, and Kirsty Sedgman. This has been the panel room. Thank you. Enjoy QED.